Okay, let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Starting Your Journey, a Roadmap for ICS OT Cybersecurity. Again, my name is Ellie Prodler, Product Marketing Manager of Global Services here at Dragos. We have just a couple of housekeeping items today. First, the session is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to all of our registrants and attendees after the webinar. Also, your microphone has been muted, but we still want you to interact with us. So please use the Q&A chat feature to submit any questions, and we'll get to them at the end. Now I'd like to introduce Jason Christopher, Director of Cyber Risk at Dragos. Jason takes an innovative approach to risk management, blending traditional risk engineering with state-of-the-art technology and services to align key decision makers and executives around cyber risks. Jason, we're so excited to have you today. Take it away.
Thanks, Ellie. So everyone, again, welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about starting your journey. In this case, having actually a roadmap for what you may do in ICS and OT security. Now, even if you've not just started your journey, let's say you've been on your journey for about 10 years, I'd also like to make sure that you understand that you could use this roadmap at any part of your staging for your ICS security journey itself, for continuing to improve your actual ICS security program. We all know, and I'll say this several times, I think, during this presentation, that security itself is not a destination. It's going to be a journey. You're never just going to throw up your hands and be like, well, I'm secure. There's going to be a part of this I'll have to talk about continuous improvement as you look at what your program is currently doing and how you want to be able to get better at that. So with that, I'll do a little bit of introduction as to my background and sort of why it is that I'm on the stage here. So I am the Director of Cyber Risk here at Dragos, as Ellie just introduced me as. What I should also point out is I've been in industry for a long time, not only helping folks with maturing their program, but actually maturing programs myself. I've been a company executive, I've been a cybersecurity researcher, and I have also gone through regulatory regimes such as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, critical infrastructure protection standards, the NERC-CIP standards that are mandatory enforceable in the electric sector. I've also been an incident responder working with the U.S. Department of Energy and done various different roles across industry from all those different angles of how do you look at this problem of cybersecurity. I will say just bluntly, I think I've had a lucky career, right time, right place, and being able to take those lessons learned and apply that to what our clients are currently looking at, which we'll actually do as part of the conversation today. We're going to talk about road mapping. A lot of folks, when you hear the term roadmap, you're probably thinking either something that's like a project management driven conversation, or maybe a how do I get from point A to point B. So I want to level set a little bit before we get into that conversation by starting off with some initial questions. As everyone sort of gets into the webinar here today, I want you to sort of understand that you're going to start somewhere. And what you're going to start with is maybe that initial step, but you want to know what direction you're headed in. You want to have an idea of where it is you're going. Maybe take out a compass, take out a map. All those things that we use in navigational senses can be used for road mapping that we're going to discuss today. But that also means understanding what is important. What's important not just for you and your program, but what's important for your organization. What are the impacts that your organization, that your business really cares about? One of the things I could say after working with so many CISOs during my career, Chief Information Security Officers, is that they're really good at securing their program. They're really good at understanding security, but they may not be that great at being able to make that comprehensible to the other executives, to the CEO, to the folks at the end of the day who are writing the checks to say what our program is or is not going to be able to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, maybe frame up the problem space before we get into what is a roadmap. And I don't want there to be a roadmap that you all walk away with like 50,000 steps. That wouldn't be useful for anybody. Instead, we're going to do something that's going to be very simple. I would say deviously simple even, because it's going to look very sort of truncated. It's going to say, oh, there's only a few steps here. This is easy. But this is a journey that may take you not only months, but years to be able to get to sort of the maturation state that you want to say, hey, I've got a sustainable ICS security program now. So we'll go through that and sort of understand what those steps may be before then actually providing a real world use case. As I've said throughout my career, not only have I been able to help folks do this, but I've done this myself. And I want to give you that actionable guidance. It's not good enough to just be able to sit in a webinar and talk about things in an academic sense, show you some charts and graphs and say, oh, all right, it's all done now. You have to understand that this is actually a solvable, doable problem, and that many folks like you have already gone through this and been very successful in their ICS and OT security program. With that, I need to be able to start off with what is ICS and OT for those of you who may not be familiar. Maybe you come from the IT, the sort of enterprise versioning of this. You're looking on the outside going into the plants and saying, how do you do security here? And you may have some of your plant operators shrug and say, I thought that was your job. But the technologies aren't the same. The differences between IT and OT are going to come up time and time again, especially as you put in new security controls. What you need to understand is what we're talking about for OT is operational technology, or ICS, industrial control systems. Those are going to be the things in the real world that take the zeros and the ones and make them something that opens a lever, closes a valve, opens a switch. It's not just going to be sort of the data that we protect in our enterprise organizations, but the actual things that move a physical process at the end of the day. And they are a little different than our IT assets. They have a life cycle that is literally decades long, which means that we're not switching those things out every few years like you may your phone or your laptops. And they have to be operational 24/7 in most cases. In the United States and North America, we talk about it in terms of 16 critical infrastructure: water, power, food and beverage, manufacturing, things of that nature. In other parts of the world, you may have other ways to be able to bifurcate what those infrastructures look like, including, for example, the NIST directive in Europe, where maybe you're talking about those operators of essential services, for example. At the end of the day, though, what we're talking through for the technology perspective is, again, when a 0 or a 1 impacts that physical world. So we're talking about things like motors, sensors, generators, safety systems, things that we know will have that real world physical attribute and not just moving data from one place to another. If this is your first time going through this, I have talked about several different ways to look at maturity or talk about metrics and measurements over the years. This was actually from the DISC SANS summit that we did right at the very beginning of lockdowns and pandemic in May of 2020. I talked about the ICS Security Crucible. So there is a URL here and now also in the chat that if you want to be able to check that out after this presentation, super useful background to be able to say, well, what does it mean to go through a model of some sort to give me an understanding of what security controls I should put in place. And we did that for a starting point for any security program. So it didn't matter what side of the fence you're coming from the IT side or the OT side, but trying to bridge that divide. And selfishly, I thought it was cool because I got to use like medieval weapons to describe your security program. There's a lot of different ways that you could use to sort of bridge the technical gap. And I gave an example of that during that presentation. So if you come out of this over the next half hour, 45 minutes, and you're like, I need a little bit more, there's a lot more content that we'll provide to you during the links that we'll provide during this presentation itself, but also just some of the things that we have on our YouTube channel and in our website. So definitely make sure that you're staying tuned to that and know that we're not just leaving you hanging. There's a lot of additional material and content out there to be able to help you along this journey. So with that, why should we talk about this? Well, I thought this was a very interesting statistic that came out of Gartner based off of a survey that they had done with industrial organizations, saying that by 2023, so next year, 75% of organizations are going to restructure their risk and security governance. That's going to be addressing the IT, OT, Internet of Things, and physical security needs. And in 2021, just a year ago, the people who identified they would do that was less than 15%. That's a huge jump. So I'm assuming that many of you who are on this webinar, who are going to be listening to this recording later on, may be part of that 75%, because that is a very large number. And that means that we may have missed the mark somewhere. Or maybe it is that executives have started looking at this a little bit differently. At the end of the day, though, it does mean that we need to look at how we'll address this problem to move us a little bit further. So why now? Why is this all of a sudden an issue that we're hearing about that people are concerned with? Well, first and foremost, sort of understanding that we are looking at an increased workforce for the first time ever that is doing ICS security. And what do I mean by that? Well, when I had started this journey on my own 20 years ago, we would joke that there were like dozens of us, maybe hundreds of us that were looking at ICS security, because it really was an afterthought. We had the OT systems, we had the ICS engineering capabilities, but they were designed to be used by a good and smart engineer. As an engineer, I didn't really think about cybersecurity until one day I asked about it, and I was told, don't worry about it. Our telecommunication provider has it covered. And I really didn't know at the time why that was wrong. I had to go back to school. I had to do a lot of school of hard knocks and learning myself to figure out what were the approaches that would be reasonable for an organization to be able to own their own security. By the end of the day, you do own your own risk. You fast forward to today, there aren't dozens of us, there aren't hundreds of us, there are thousands of us that are looking at ICS security. And because of that growth, we're now seeing and hearing more about the marketplace. We're hearing more about the industry itself and the community evolving and being able to try to figure out how to solve this risk as it stands. And boards and executives. Now we're seeing an increased sort of highlight, bold, underline, not just security, which originally when folks were thinking, cybersecurity, you mean my IT department, you mean my email, you mean the phishing attempts that we need to be able to look at. We now see attackers going after safety systems, going after actual devices in our distributed control systems or in our SCADA networks. And now we have boards and executives asking more than ever, well, what are you doing about securing our operational technology, our industrial control system space, beyond just, do we have good firewalls in place? Are we doing phishing attempts? Those types of conversations are absolutely escalating this quite high. And very recently, you see that the SEC here in the United States has gone through and said that you're going to have more security governance in the boards themselves to be able to manage this risk. So I only see this as an increasing slope when we talk about executive engagements with our security programs. Also, increasing projects. The projects here are also really interesting because the technology is changing a little bit. I imagine many of you on this call have actually been already asked things like, well, what if we just had some more cloud connectivity into our industrial control system? We can get more data that way, and we can then optimize what our processes are. That may save an organization millions of dollars. How do you then counterbalance that savings of millions of dollars with the security risk that may be in play that could have real human safety impacts or property damage impacts as a result? It requires, again, that escalation of conversation here. And there is that OT and IT divide. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that there are a series of different expertise that you may have inside your organization. One looking at securing the data, which is also important. And then there's the securing the operations, which will have those impacts again that are very different, that are talking about our physical processes and maybe even the way that we produce goods and services to our customers. And so in those cases there, you want to be able to figure out how can you leverage these two things working together. And lastly, culture. Culture is extremely important. One of those things that you'll hear a phrasing around is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It doesn't matter how well of a roadmap I have. If I don't have the right culture in place of safety and security, then I may not be able to get to that endpoint that I really want to have, which is ultimately improving the security posture of the organization. And so as these things all come together and collide, we have to have then a conversation about what we can do to move forward. And one last note, again, on that IT side, if you're looking at IT-centric controls and you're trying to apply it into your OT systems and you just want to slap them right in there as is, you're going to have a bad day. You can see here that there's limited effectiveness, and there could even be some downright bad problems if you just take the IT security program that you already have and put it into the plant operations. One example is patching. Patching is one of the most routine things that we do on the IT side. We have vulnerabilities, we patch them, and we go from there. However, on the OT side, that would actually require operational outages in a lot of cases. You can also see here, antivirus, endpoint agents, those give you incomplete sort of visibility, but you also may not be able to install them. When I talk about some of these things like controllers, they are very simple devices. They don't have the ability to install antivirus. They don't even have the ability in many cases to do authentication. Maybe if I'm lucky, I can enter a 4-digit PIN as my authentication measure. So you can see that a lot of the strategies that you may deploy on IT just wouldn't be appropriate for OT. And so we really need to start thinking about this a little bit differently to make sure that we have our own OT-centric strategy and roadmap as we want to develop it. And very recently, we actually did a survey with the Ponemon Institute to sort of ask about some of the roadblocks that may be happening during this road mapping effort for conversations across the IT and OT space. And you can see here, right up front, I thought this was really interesting because we're talking about now a 50-50 split. You can select more than one answer here, which is why the percentages would go above 100 if you added them together. But you can see that there's a conversation about OT being managed by the engineering department, which would not have security expertise, or another roadblock being that the OT security is managed by the IT department, which doesn't know engineering. And so it again highlights that we need to come together to be able to talk about this problem in a unique fashion that would also help us out with this last bullet here, which I thought was interesting, that a full third of respondents thought that there was competition between the IT and OT budget dollars for what you would do for new security projects. So again, how can we overcome this? Well, that is where we'd want to be able to use roadmaps. Now, roadmaps I have here as deceptively simple. They don't have to be overcomplicated. They don't have to take you years to deploy. As a matter of fact, I would argue that you should probably reevaluate your roadmap every year or so because things are going to change. The threats are going to change. The new projects that you have are going to change. And as a result of that, you should probably change your roadmap. So what is a roadmap? Well, it would be directional in nature, meaning that it should help you align your business objectives to cyber risk. It should also prioritize projects and your programmatic improvements overall. They should also be transparent. You shouldn't just create a roadmap and just sort of lock it up somewhere else. You want to make sure that folks are aware of what it is that you're doing. That helps you with that cultural piece because you can get to organizational change that way. So when you share them broadly, you'll find that it gets you insights to getting resources that you may need. If everyone's aligned to your roadmap or is at least aware of it, it would make things like budget conversations just a little bit easier. And they could be tied to trends and current threats. Again, I would expect you to be able to update your roadmap, not be able to just say, well, I'm done, it's good. You want to be able to update it based off of the latest trends, the latest things that you're able to see, and then sort of correlate and respond accordingly. Now, what are they not? Because they absolutely are adaptable, but they are not something as a result that are auditable standards. There are standards that are out there. I've been on standard drafting teams. Standards provide a very good baseline conversation about what sort of controls you need in place. And they should be part of your roadmap at some point. There should be a discussion about what you want to be able to implement, but the roadmap itself is not something you're going to audit to, for example, because it has to be flexible. It's not written in stone. Standards and requirements and auditable things, they are. So you want to make sure that you're able to get that flexibility, but also at the same time, make sure that you are having a governance structure in place for your overall program. And maybe that's something that's identified in your roadmap, for example. It's not something that's going to replace a governance structure. It's not something that's going to replace the way that you may do risk and compliance. What it's trying to say is I am at point A and I need to get to point B. The overall encompassing thing then as a roadmap is being able to give you that breadth around that so that you can then apply it in a way that is meaningful to your organization and tailorable as a result. So here's a roadmap. Here's a road, at least. And let's say that we have a minimal ICS and OT security program on this left end here, and we know we want to get to a sustainable ICS OT security program on the other side. How do we get there? So this roadmap, again, is going to be very simple because I don't think it needs to be 50 steps. You'll have smaller steps inside these bigger steps for sure. These are large categories of activities you want to be able to perform. And we've also been able to demonstrate with clients and with folks that we've worked with that you can do this in a year or less. So if you're starting from nothing, you should be able to get something sustainable if you've got the right players involved in that time frame. And let's talk about that towards the end when I give you an example and a use case for this. But let's start off with the very first step, understanding our risks and impacts. For this step, you're going to ask yourself the key question, what does a really bad day look like? What that should tell you is not only what it means to you, but what it also means to plant operations, what it means to the business itself, and then you'll be able to evaluate potential impacts as a result of that. So how do we start off with understanding those risks and those impacts? Well, see here, I'm starting off with boom. Boom is the bad day. And you'll hear this time and time again in all areas of cybersecurity, but we have a concept where we talk about left of boom and right of boom, where left of boom is going to be the proactive things that we do to make sure as best we can that boom doesn't happen. It means that we're talking about system hardening, that we're monitoring threats, that we're doing this proactive security program management that we'd have in place for system hardening and configurations, that we want to make sure that we're managing or at least identifying vulnerabilities that may be exploited. All the good stuff that you hear out of security standards is that left of boom conversation. For the right of boom piece, that's where the bad thing has happened. And now you now need to respond and recover. But in order to respond, we need to be able to detect. one of the key things that I'll typically ask folks is, if we go through this, if you're having a conversation around sort of detection and response, if you were to have a bad day, let's say you have a plant outage, how long would it take you to understand that that plant outage is actually caused by a cyber event? Most of the time, plant operations would not think of that, especially if it's something like a controller failure. Controls fail. And when they look at a controller failure, they may just say, you know what, I'm going to swap that thing out. And there will be no sort of conversation on what we did to contain or eradicate that threat, because it wasn't even part of the way that they do business, which means there's no way for us as security professionals to know the same. So as we think through what cyber means could look like here, left of boom is telling you how do you reduce your risk, your actual likelihood of an event taking place. And that right of boom concept is talking about how do we reduce the impact now that a bad thing has actually happened. But impact isn't so clear cut. Within the concepts of impacts here, this actually came from a white paper that we had produced last year on industrial cyber risk management. We can sort of see that we've got these different categorizations of what a cyber risk impact could look like, all the way from very low to very high, but in these main categories where I could see things like environmental impacts. If I'm just taking an IT-centric program, I likely am not looking at environmental impacts. When I'm doing IT-centric things, I'm talking about loss of data, not loss of environmental pieces near my plants, and obviously safety, loss of life, loss of limb, things that could happen when you have, for example, an explosion that would take place, the release of chemicals, or anything else that may have a long-term health or short-term sort of safety conversation around your employees and your plant operators. So as we build through that, and again, I'm already seeing questions are popping up. I will answer questions at the end of the presentation. So again, use that Q&A feature that Ellie told you about. I'll be able to provide some insights towards the end of this. But as you sort of work through what the ideas around impacts could possibly be, you have two ways of looking at it. You can do it with historical information. So what have we already seen, either maybe ourselves or across our industry or across our sort of geography and geopolitical landscape? In which case you'd probably say, I've seen a lot of ransomware. And you could probably even say then, well, what would it look like if I had ransomware inside our plant environment? And you can start going from the historical, where we could sort of maybe get to orders of magnitude that are larger than what maybe you've already seen to impact your operations, to things that would be more hypothetical in nature. Hey, we've seen sort of threat adversaries go after safety systems. What would that look like in our environment? The key at the end of the day is understanding that you could use either historical or hypothetical scenarios to then figure out what that bad day really could be for you, even if you've not experienced it. Because if you're thinking outside the box a little bit, if you're thinking about the scenarios in broader terms, it'll allow you to be able to manage the possible bad days the way that they come. Meaning, if I go to the extreme on some of those impacts and I really understand what that bad day could absolutely look like, that will then help inform what type of threats I may be concerned about, as well as what type of protections I should have in place. So understanding that from a very sort of core value of what are those bad days will allow you to understand for your OT program, what are the next steps you'd want to be able to have in place. And for those of you who have never done scenario generation, there are a lot of cool tools out there that you could use. If you've done a tabletop exercise, then you've already sort of gone through scenario generation, but what you may not have done with that is actually identify it as a risk. You may have identified it as a way that we could test out what we do for incident response and recovery. If we look at it from a risk perspective, then one of the things that we could do is look at different types of scenarios. You may have, over the course of a period of time, one large event with one boom, one bad day, where we can start talking about the things that are on the left side of that boom and the right side of that boom to understand what our overall reduction in impact should look like. But there are a lot of ways that a bad day could happen. There could be a series of very large scenarios that take place simultaneously, or smaller ones, or even the conversation of a death from a million cuts. If we were to have a degraded state over a long period of time, what would it look like when that bad day eventually came out and we didn't have the same capabilities that we would typically have for maybe manual operations or other things that we would rely on for passive safety elements or things of that? Maybe another scenario had further along the way incapacitated us. Or just sort of shrinking that down and having a series of bad days that could lead to a catastrophic failure in some way or another. The key thing here that I really love to do, especially with engineers, is I like to give them sort of a threat briefing, tell them about the bad things that have happened in the world, not in a doom and gloom, fear, uncertainty, doubt, fuddy type of way. I like to be able to tell it to them because they understand then that these are real risks that we care about. And after I give them maybe a half hour, an hour presentation about the different threats out there, I'll then ask them, well, what does your bad day really look like? And believe me, your engineers know. They have an absolute concept about what the bad thing would happen for production, for their own facilities, and for their own teams if they were not able to have certain aspects of their assets in place, or the security controls or safety controls that they think may actually be able to help them out during those type of periods. And what that should get you to is this conversation about your crown jewels. What are the things that you really care about? The things that at the end of the day, that if they weren't working, you would have that really bad day. Well, there's a white paper here on this link here as well. Another one that we can put in the chat that talks about the crown jewels. We're using an example of Acme Power. You can go through and find out, well, what are my critical systems or subsystems? I really care about substation control. You could have another one for generation control. You could have another one for distribution control. And then understand that you're talking here, in this case, about power transmission. Again, you could use one for generation, distribution, for all aspects of your business. And your critical components. You'd work with your engineering team. Again, getting rid of that IT-OT divide. We can start talking about on the engineering side, relays and capacitor banks and transformers, this instrumentation we have in those substations. And then ask them, well, what are the controllers? What are the things that actually allow the power to flow? And they can talk to you about their programmable logical controllers, their PLCs, talk about localized control that they may have in place. And then you can sit down and figure out, well, what are those crown jewels then? If I were to really have that bad day, what are the things that I then need to put around instead of this idea of defense in depth, defense in breadth around those assets to make sure that that bad day, if it not, so that it doesn't necessarily happen, because nothing will be totally impervious, but to say, could I at least detect something and then respond and recover in an appropriate manner? So that first step, I know it sounds like a lot, but we've actually been able to demonstrate that we can do this in a couple of days, a couple of weeks, at least to start off. A couple of workshops with the right engineers in place, with the right folks on the IT side, maybe financial, maybe legal, maybe human resources, to just be able to understand what do those bad days look like, and then be able to start building out what those impacts may be, understanding what those risks and evaluate them as possible. And again, knowing that you're just going to start off on the starting point. You're not going to be perfect in all of these things, but if at least if you're starting in those initial steps, you'll find when we get to this next step, that you'll have at least a backbone to be able to understand, or I should say a foundation to understand what are the things that you then want to be able to evaluate. And that's where the second step in this roadmap comes in. Determine your maturity and your gaps. So for determining those, you want to think about this in a crawl, walk, run fashion. And you want to be honest about your capabilities, because for a roadmap to be really effective, you need to be not only sort of the pie in the sky, where do I want to be, but you need to be very honest about where you are. Because the next step would require you to be able to take, okay, if I'm not really there, if I'm not really at the place that I think I'm starting at, should I really go into having a multi-million-dollar budget of additional things that maybe I can't manage quite yet? So being very honest with you allows you to understand if you're really crawling, if you're really walking, or you're really running, that you want to be able to then understand, well, how do I build myself into that runner? If you're just starting from the couch and you decide you're going to try to run an 8-minute mile right off that couch, it may be painful at first. But if you say, you know what, I first want to start off with just doing a light, brisk jog, and we'll get there for a couple of miles. Then you can start getting that endurance, getting that training, getting that ability to run as you go through that. And that then understands then your future state just a little bit better. So what do we mean by that crawl, walk, run approach? So first, you are going to be crawling. Many of you may already be there, especially when we talk about OT security versus your IT security program. So your initial defenses may be resource constrained. You may have a person, if you're lucky, maybe 0.25 of an FTE, a full-time employee, to be able to do your ICS security program. There's no documentation in place. You have a hero or a team of heroes that are doing the activity because they know it's the good thing to do, not necessarily because somebody told them to. They take configuration baselines because they know it's easier for them to respond and recover if they had them, not because there's a document that says you should have configuration baselines. Now, that said, the loss of lotto winners could cripple the program. What do I mean by lotto winners? I hate the analogy where people say, well, if Bob got hit by a bus tomorrow and didn't come to work, what would you do with your program? Because I don't want Bob to get hit by a bus. But what if Bob won the lottery? And despite really loving his job, he didn't come back for let's say the first week. He just wanted to take vacation. Okay, maybe it was like a month or two. Maybe it's been a couple years and Bob's not coming back because that was a great lottery payout. If you're people who would leave because of the lottery, not being hit by buses, don't come back, what happens to your program? If your answer is it's absolutely cratered, nothing returns, I can't do anything, then you may be in that crawling stage. When we get to that walking stage, that's when we can move beyond this idea of oral history, where we can have documentation put in place. So we do configuration management because we have a documented process that we follow for configuration management on all of our controllers. Here's a document. Here's the Excel spreadsheet maybe that we start off with, because everyone starts with Excel spreadsheets. Maybe we've gone to more automated fashions, but at least here's something to start with, and we're walking. And now you have multiple stakeholders who are involved, and your resources, I wouldn't say are totally complete, but they're less scarce. You're not fighting as much as you were for budget dollars, maybe in your crawling step. So then running. And what do I expect to see out of an ICS OT security program that is fully running? Your people are trained, they are ready, they are exercised, your executives are willing participants in that ICS security program, and your capabilities are double checked and reviewed. When I say double checked and reviewed, I may mean that you have an internal audit team, or you have somebody saying, hey, these are the rules that we say we follow. You're doing this. How do I make sure that you're actually doing what I say you should be doing? And those internal reviews are the important things that allow us to be more mature and track those lessons learned over time. So crawl, walk, run. A lot of you may be at crawling. Many of you may be at walking. Some of you may even be running right now. How do we then sustain and measure that program over time? We think of this idea as maturity indicator levels, or MILs. If you're familiar with the maturity model aspect, what this does, it means that it indicates what your maturity is actually at. And one of the things I'd like to be able to talk to you about is just several different types of maturity models that we may have. In the previous webinar that I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, I actually sort of sneakily used the NIST cybersecurity framework to talk about maturity models. There's another one that is also widely popular, the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, the C2M2. That was actually the program that I helped run when I was at the US Department of Energy. And what it does, it looks at what we mean by capabilities, the crawl, walk, run approach, and look at it from a process, technology, and people perspective. Because all of those things would combine to become a capability. Maybe you don't have the technology in place. Can you offset that with people and processes? It's sort of like a three-legged stool. Where do you want to invest more of your folks and more of your time and money when you go through and talk about, well, can I do asset management really well? If you use an Excel spreadsheet, yeah, you're doing it. If I had an automated solution, that's probably doing a little bit better, because at least I'm not having somebody do a walk down and having to track that Excel spreadsheet, version controls on the Excel spreadsheet. Where am I storing and saving that Excel spreadsheet? There are a lot of ways to say that I'm starting off with something very, very crawling steps to the running steps. And what is really interesting about the C2M2 is that it understands that you're going to get scored differently across multiple different domains. There are 10 domains within the C2M2 that you should pay attention to that talks about everything from risk management to asset management to what you do during an incident. And it looks at that from this perspective of that crawl, walk, run. Maturity indicator level 1, maturity indicator level 2, maturity indicator level 3. Each of those are going to get more sophisticated with time. And we can then build that into another conversation about our management objectives. What do we do to actually manage the thing at the end of the day? Do I have documentation in place? Do I have policies in place? Do I have adequate resources? Very different than the sort of, I do authentication. Oh, I do multi-factor authentication. That's a little bit more mature, right? I have passwords to strong passwords to I'm doing multi-factor authentication. There's all R authentication, but one is crawling, one would be walking, one would be running. Well, for management, it's a little bit different. Do I manage at all? Or do I have a team of heroes doing this? Or do I have adequate resources in place? Do I have documentation in place? Do I have policies in place? So you can see that you can talk about that from a management perspective as well. And what you get out of the cybersecurity capability maturity model, or any maturity model, is a scoring at the end of the day. You can see here there are 10 domains, everything from asset management to access and identity management, situational awareness, third-party risk, workforce, or cybersecurity architecture. You can build out that program. There's a link right now in the chat about going to that actual maturity model itself. But what I want you to understand is that you want to start with the second step in your roadmap to figure out where you are. Get to this idea of, I'm currently here. This is my score. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be even MIL 1 across the board. Maybe you're not crawling in anything. That's perfectly fine. You have to be honest with yourself because you want to build a program that will eventually get you to that walking or running stage in each one of these domains based off of where it is you think you can get those resources, but also what your risks are as an organization. Or applying that crawl, walk, run, like you can see here, if you put on a cape and you can then fly, approach across your cybersecurity program to understand on the OT side, where are your strengths, where are your gaps. So if I reverse that and start saying, okay, well, that's my current maturity indicator levels, where do I want to be? You can be really open with yourself and say, well, I know I'm not going to be MIL 3 across the board. As a matter of fact, maybe in some places it's cost prohibitive for me to be able to do so. But at least I want to track where I want to go with these gaps and start bridging those gaps and start understanding from a prioritization state where I should go next, which would be sort of the next step that we'd have in this roadmap. So we've understood the risks. We have an idea of the scenarios that we're really concerned with. We have impact criteria that our engineers and our IT folks are all on board with. We've looked at a maturity model to be able to understand, well, where are the things we're really strong in compared to where the things that we may need to be able to have more resources for. Well, how do I then actually resource that? How do I prioritize those things? If I have a gap in asset management, is this the same thing as having a gap in incident response? How long would it take me to get from point A to point B for each of those? For this one here, we're going to implement and measure. And I want you to remember this quote that I said in the beginning. It's a journey. It's the journey and not the destination itself that will matter. So we're going to prioritize those gaps, and we're also going to create methods for consistent measuring to note successes. Because if you've already said, hey, I have these gaps over here, and I want to get over here to be able to demonstrate that I'm at a sustainable program, you need to measure. Your executives, your management is going to ask you, how do I know that you're actually successful in this? And that's a fair question. To do that, you have to start measuring somewhere. And maybe one of your first measurements that you'd want to be able to look at is that risk register. So a risk register would take those scenarios that we have, and you can see here, we've got the various different impacts from financial, safety, business continuity, environmental, reputation, and national impacts. And we also have what our response would be and the cost benefit analysis. So if an executive sees, oh, whoa, this one over here about having a threat activity group target our safety systems, that could be $70 million on our risk register. What's our risk response here? Well, we can do some monitoring and training, and you can start seeing then, oh, wow, a $350,000 sort of cost benefit analysis compared to a $70 million plus impact. That could have some eyebrows get raised and could lead towards those resource conversations. Risk registers are very powerful tools. They're sort of the one-stop shop for your high-level risk discussions. It's a management tool that you could use for tracking, but it's not a silver bullet. And just having one doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to solve all your risks. You actually need to use it as a communication tool, and you need to make sure that you're updating it over time. If you want more information on this one, this link is also in the chat and down here on the bottom of the slide. That was tied back to the OT cyber risk work that we did as part of industrial cyber risk management. So we start measuring things. How do we actually start figuring out what matters? Well, this is actually a useful way to think about metrics themselves. Metrics are difficult. I love metrics. I love measuring things. It goes back to my engineering background. But it means that we need to figure out a way to not only create the metric, but you have to be able to collect the data that supports the metric. You have to store that data somewhere, also securely. You have to have a way to analyze and compile the data, report those metrics, and yes, you actually have to use them. And it's, again, not a stop that you do. It's a continuous improvement process. One of the things that I'll say for resourcing, I would typically, if I had a team of, even just like 1 to 3 employees, I wouldn't give that team any more than 3 to 4 metrics per team member. At that point, they're doing more to admire the problem than solve the problem. And so you want to make sure that there are metrics that they can collect this data for, they can actually analyze the data, but that again leans back towards what are the objectives you care about. So in this, actually, I teach a 2-day class with the SANS Institute, also with my co-author, Dean Parsons, on ICS Security Management. And we started talking through what matters most. And this is actually one of the concepts that we discussed, which is how do we use this to sort of measure out things and make sure that the measurements mean something to the business. So stating those goals, identifying the data sources, understanding those goals can get you to a meaningful discussion about why you're measuring what you measure. So for example, let's say that your goal is to decrease potential downtime from ICS cyber incidents, and you come up with 3 different key performance indicators, KPIs: mean time to fix, incident requiring manual cleanup, numbers of ICS security skills per employee, and you can start figuring out what the benefits are and what the data that you actually need is. And again, some of this is stuff that even on the IT side, mean time to fix is a very popular metric. It demonstrates your incident response team's effectiveness. And all you need to be able to figure out is how many hours were spent on the incidents. But maybe that's too much. Maybe that is too much data for where you are in this crawling step. In which case, maybe you could just start with something really simple. Like if you were trying to figure out, could you detect an incident? Maybe you need to start with, do I have even network visibility? And so maybe you can create a very simple metric over time to say, hey, across all our different environments, here's the percentage of coverage I have for detection. That I can then say, I understand that we can detect an incident and respond accordingly. Because again, you're trying to protect those crown jewels. And you can't protect what you can't see. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. One of the mottos that you should also use in sort of the protection conversation is that protection itself is ideal, but detection is a must. You must be able to detect. And I would even caveat that further. If you don't have a way to respond once you detect, then you may want to also look at response as well. So being able to then drive towards those mottos to understand what you need and how it is you're going to leverage this to protect your crown jewels will ultimately help you out, not only from the how do I measure this thing, or really why does measurement matter? Because it leads you to, again, this idea of a successful criteria that you can demonstrate that you're moving along on this roadmap, that you're moving along on your journey and getting just a little bit more complete. So I want to conclude with just a very quick real world example. It's one thing to be able to say, oh, that was nice. You showed me a table of KPIs. That seems very academic or project management of you. But I've seen this work several times. And actually, most recently, I'd worked with a manufacturing organization that had deployed everything you just seen in that sort of overall roadmap effort. And it started off with just sort of an initial discussion. Every single person that I talk to, the very first time they see me, if I'm in a plant, not just normally like at a restaurant or a bar, is how good are we doing in ICS security? How good am I compared to my peers, which frankly doesn't really matter as much because the threat doesn't care about your peers, the threat cares about you. But they do want to know, how well am I doing objectively? Can you just tell me? And that led to an in-depth conversation about the crown jewels, about those impacts, about the architecture that's protecting those crown jewels, and unsurprisingly, issues were found. Again, because for many folks on the OT ICS security journey, it's sort of been not really discussed for a while. We've focused a lot on IT security, and we just sort of assumed that there would be security all around. So in terms of understanding and going through those, we could then figure out, well, what were the quick wins to shore up those mitigations, those things that we found that were a little bit problem areas. And that led to both a combination of low-hanging fruit, so to be able to quickly demonstrate, hey, we're able to go through and audit our firewall rules and really make sure we had a hard shell around the GUI center of our industrial control center. But then we also had to address some high severity issues, because that low-hanging fruit is not always going to be those sort of really big impactful things. And so understanding that tug and pull, there's politics in play, there's how can I get those resources in play, and be able to understand that they want to be able to quickly get an incident response retainer in place because they knew that they didn't have the capability to respond and recover, but at least having that incident response retainer meant that they could immediately get somebody on site and be able to help them out if they had a really bad, actively trying to shore up the rest of the vulnerabilities in their systems. That also include increasing network visibility, because again, you can't respond to what you cannot detect, and doing that hand in hand with that system hardening perspective, all based off this idea of what is the impact from a really bad day, those risk response criteria that we saw earlier. And they started tracking a scorecard, very simple scorecard at first, because for a lot of the different manufacturing plant environments, they were at the nil zero. They weren't even at the crawling steps yet. So they wanted to get everybody crawling before then talking about, okay, can we walk now? Can we run? Maybe some facilities will be able to run quicker than others, but could we at least get everyone at the same level page? And so they started developing some scorecards. They started to establish what that could look like from an overall robust program, get that funding in place, make sure they had that OT security champion at each one of the different facilities, and then overall started then reporting that back to their executives and started managing cyber risk. So again, and I will go and open up questions in a second, because I imagine there are quite a few. If you're starting off with a very minimal ICS OT security program, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, what does a bad day look like? Get the right people to be able to answer that question. Get the engineers involved if you're on the IT side. If you're on the engineering side, get the IT security folks involved, because they may be able to tell you about some of the security protections that they may have in place around the perimeter. And then understand what matters most to your business, and then evaluate those potential impacts. Then you want to do a gap analysis. Where are you mature? Where are you not mature? Be very open and honest with yourself so you can then build into a maturity-based program with scorecards that allow you to at least figure out roughly where you want to be able to do from that crawl, walk, run perspective. Before then, prioritizing those gaps and actually measuring what matters most to your organization, which could be reputational and matter. It could be safety and matter. It could be environmental or property impacts. All of those things could then tie back to what are the things we care about most. Maybe I want to be able to demonstrate my incident response program is better today than it was last year. And there are metrics for you to be able to do that. Once you go through that journey, and it's a starting point, you'll be able to say you've got at least something sustainable because you're measuring, you're able to review what it was you were able to do before, and then you're able to then, at the end of the day, demonstrate that you're managing that cyber risk component. And with that, I know that I've got about 15 minutes left on the clock. I will go through some of the Q&A, and there are, oh, wow. Okay, so a lot of people have questions. Okay, so you ask, why now? How much of an impact do you feel current events in Ukraine? Yeah, so when this question regarding why now and the current events that are taking place and the public events, like things that we've seen from the Ukraine, Colonial Pipeline, ransomware events like Norsk Hydro, all of those different conversations, I would say, lead to additional motivation for why now. One of the things that I've noticed over my career is that when you see a big event take place, you'll probably get a lot of immediate attention, a lot of immediate sort of, I need to know what's going on from your executives. Back in Heartbleed and shell shock times, a lot of folks, when vulnerabilities have got logos and on the front page of the newspaper, you then need to respond very quickly to executive engagement. And what I'll tell people in those moments is to strike while the iron is hot. That motivation could lead to drastic increases in your program maturity because folks are paying attention to what it is that you need to worry about. That said, that motivation won't always be there all the time. We sort of have short memories over the lifespan of the things that really matter to us in cybersecurity. Take, for example, the Target breach. While that wasn't OT, we saw a lot of board activities because there were actually people ousted from the board of directors because of failure of fiduciary duties. That got a lot of board of directors panicking about cybersecurity. But you fast forward about a year or two after the Target breach, people weren't talking about it in the same way. So strike while the iron's hot, be opportunistic in that sense, because you're going to have to understand that in a year or two after these sort of events are taking place, you may not get that same level of attention that you were getting previously. So absolutely, current events do really work on the conversation of change management, organizational change, changing the culture of your organization, even if it's for a short period of time to get a long-term win out of those programs. Let's see, as more utilities are encouraged to bring their operations to the cloud, what are the risks involved and how do you keep the gaps from the IT side? So I would say industrial organizations as a whole have been talking about the cloud more and more, and it's a very complicated issue. What I mean by that is, again, there are real business optimization things that are taking place with cloud information. Now, I've seen organizations have what I'd call the sort of edge cloud network, where they're monitoring, they have their own instance of a firewall that's just really looking at that one cloud piece in particular. I haven't seen operations in the cloud, thankfully. It tells me that we're doing a really good conversation there of don't do that, please. But we need to be able to talk about the trade-offs. You can't just say no. You need to be able to talk about what are the business impacts versus what the security impacts are, which is why, again, we recommend going through that scenario-based approach, because it allows executives to further understand what are those questions and techniques that they need to know to be able to make a business decision. If you just say no and don't give them any context behind it outside of it's going to be a bad day, you need to get a little bit more mature with that approach. The example I'll give is when we first started introducing TCP/IP into all our different networks, there were a lot of security professionals that were hip to what cyber risk could be, even in the early 2000s. And they said, no way, no how. You're not going to put TCP/IP into my substations. And they obviously won the debate, and we have no TCP/IP in any of our industrial control systems. That was a joke. We have it everywhere. And it's because we weren't able to talk about the different trade-offs between what it is they're getting from an optimization perspective versus what those cyber risks are. We are way more mature in this today, so we should be able to do that. And the same thing would be true for conversations around what you do for cloud computing in particular going into the future. All right. How do you deal with SMEs who want to think of the impact only in terms of total loss of an asset? How do we drive the nuanced thinking of the so what part of the risk conversations? That's a really good one. So obviously the total loss is not going to be all the different type of impacts that you want to be able to face. There may be the sort of the loss of visibility, loss of control, loss of even the ability to look at your systems. Those would sort of get your folks more in key with what their real OT impacts would be. So there was actually a white paper written by both Mike Asante and our CEO, Rob Lee, called the ICS Kill Chain. Highly recommend picking up that paper. It's on the SANS blog post, I think. You just put in Rob Lee, Mike Asante, ICS Kill Chain. And I'll talk about the different type of attacks that you should be worried about, as well as the impact types. And those impact types are very different in OT than they are in IT. I don't care about confidentiality in my industrial control systems. I care about loss of visibility, loss of control in those pieces. Similarly, talking through things like the MITRE attack framework for ICS, that's another good resource to be able to understand those impacts for as well. Let's see here. There are a lot of good questions here. Okay. I may have to answer some of these just looking at time via maybe an email update. So how are scorecards evaluated on different industrial sites? Are there site visits involved to create the risk scorecard, or is it based on remote monitoring? So I absolutely recommend, for just the cultural reasons, doing things on site if you can. It shows the engineers that you care. I know that that's like, tongue in cheek. I highly recommend showing up with, maybe some coffee and donuts. It's my #1 disarming tool for engineers and talking with them about what it is that they do, and be able to say that you actually understand what their real impacts are that they care about. Those at the end of the day are going to be more impactful. I would say that having a scorecard for the sake of a scorecard is useful for your road mapping efforts, but having a scorecard that you had real human discussions with is great, not just for having that roadmap, but also for those cultural impacts. At the end of the day, for us as security providers, we are unfortunately the #1 people who tell everybody, no, you can't do that, right? And so like a lot of folks don't like us on the security side because they're like, oh no, you can't deploy that technology. Click on a link. Are you crazy? You can't do that either. If you want to be able to get to the point where you're influencing people and having them be a champion or an advocate for your journey, meet them where they are. And that would be the same thing for scorecards too. I would highly recommend doing workshops where you can, understanding their operations where you can, just being a part of their day-to-day sort of conversations is really powerful. And over time will lead to that culture change that I know that you want to see in security. Let's see. I am all in on the NIST cybersecurity framework. Established cybersecurity program for wastewater space. Does looking at the C2M2 warrant my time? So there is a mapping between the cybersecurity framework and the C2M2. I would say it's a bit worthwhile just to be able to understand what a different maturity model could look like. The maturity model in the NIST cybersecurity framework has tiers, so tiers 1 through 4. Now, when you look at that mapping, what I think would be important is to note is that the tiers for CSF are very limited in their scope. They're looking at things for your risk management program. They're looking at things for third-party risk. Whereas the maturity indicator levels in C2M2 are across all those different domains. Because maybe you're really good at identity and access management, but maybe you're really bad at asset management. And seeing the maturity indicator level difference would really help you out in terms of understanding what the next project is that you may want to be able to pursue. So it's just a different tool. I know a lot of folks who use both. So they may use the C2M2 because it's a little bit more granular for their day-to-day program management. But when they report to executives, they use the big 5 buckets of this cybersecurity framework, right? Because the 5 buckets is a lot easier to understand than 10 buckets. And so understanding what works for your executives and your management style, I think is the best way to go forward. Frankly, I would say use whatever works for you. It really, at the end of the day, is your journey. And what your journey is going to look very different from another organization. All right, I've got time for probably about 2 more questions out of this rapid bank of things. Let's see here. How do you propose to quantify a likelihood considering the difficulty? So the likelihood conversation in cyber risk in IT is very fudge factory. It's very, there are a lot of things that are, I wouldn't say totally made up, but they are very difficult to quantify. In ICS, it's even worse than that. we don't have the data. If you go through and you say, you know what, there's probably going to be the likelihood of an attack once every year, every 2 years. What's the metric there that you want to be able to use? Instead, what I recommend folks start with is understanding the impact first. If you understand the impact and you then realize that you're not doing anything to remediate or mitigate that impact, focus there. That matters more than the likelihood conversation, because you want to be able to, over time, mature your program to talk about things like recent threat activity, talk about things like what are the trends we see in the vulnerability space. Those are great conversations to have over time. If you're just starting off, start with impact. And folks will understand that because we don't have that data. And if you're not doing detection inside your ICS environment, then you'll never be able to get there, because you won't be able to start correlating what the outside events of likelihood look like to your internal networks. So understanding that over time, you'll get way, way better with this is the way to go. Don't try to get into the likelihood conversation right off the bat. Most folks who do will find themselves, I would say, lessening the security impacts overall because they think that the likelihood isn't there. And we all have our own biases when we view risk. There are some great conversations out there about how to do sort of a calibration for yourself so that you know what risks and likelihood could look like. But at the end of the day, if you find yourself having the debate on likelihood, try to remove yourself from it to be able to talk about impacts in a very real way before you move into more nuanced conversations about your threats that you have and the resiliency that you may have in place. Let's see here. And I've got time for probably one more. Looks like I answered a couple of these through my conversation. Can you give some examples of good KPIs and parameters that should be monitored by organizations, both for the OT cybersecurity folks and the local operating company management? So I started off with mean time to fix because I think that's probably one of the easier ones that you could start looking at. There are some really great conversations about what you could also do from a, do you have the skill set perspective? I think that's really sort of interesting from the overall, hey, especially for plant operations. Most industrial facilities, as you may know, as many of you would probably know, aren't in major metropolitan areas. As a result, our workforce may be a little bit limited in some of those cases. And so where we're trying to find more additional skills may be offset by either having, again, incident response retainers, or just being able to have a way to talk about training your people to get those OT and ICS security risk experiences that they'd want to be able to have. I also will lean again on the conversation about having the visibility inside your ICS and OT network. That's a really good one, just to be able to, very like binary almost, do I have the coverage? And if the answer is no, then what are the systems that I absolutely need to get coverage in? Because if I have a bad day, I need that data. I need to be able to respond with the detection data. I need to be able to understand what that looks like. And in order to respond quickly, I need to be able to detect what's taking place. So there's some very simple metrics. There's a whole set of other things. I could actually send out another presentation I did with the SANS Institute on metrics that really talks about what are the really in-depth things that you may want to do compared to what are the easier things that you want to do. And I would say easier is better than nothing. Start off with measuring something and you'll get better over time. If somebody asks you how tall you are and you say, I am very hungry, you didn't answer the question. But if you say, hey, I am like, 5 feet something, maybe you want to then get a little bit more mature over time. Maybe we get to the metric system and be able to talk about the things that are repeatable measurements that you can then be able to compare yourself to. So that's where I'd start on metrics overall. And with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this session. And again, you'll be able to get an email of both this recording as well as the slides, and we'll be able to go from there. There's a lot of good content on dragos.com that you can then follow up with, provide a lot of additional material, because again, this may be the start of your journey, but it's not going to be the end of it. And so I want to make sure that you've got additional resources that you can plug into if you'd like to be able to continue on your education for OT and ICS security. With that, thank you very much. Have a great day.